Good evening, everyone. I'm Ellie Breakwell, the APM Branches Coordinator, and thank you for joining us today at this APM Thames Valley Branch webinar. Please be aware this webinar is being recorded and you're in listen-only mode. There will be some interactive elements to today's webinar, so please have your phone or another web browser ready and go to menti.com and use the code 56705540. This will also be displayed on the screen with each question. Today marks the 10th webinar hosted by Richard Patterson, who is an NEC4 drafter and procurement and NEC specialist at MacDonald. If you'd like to watch any of the other webinars from Richard, these can be found on the APM YouTube channel. Please submit any questions you have for Richard via the control panel, and I will read these out to him as we go. Thanks again for joining us today, and without further ado, I'll pass over to Richard. Thanks.
Okay, so we're here this evening for me to give you a little bit of knowledge about the NEC Term Service Contract. As Ellie said, this is the 10th of the sessions I've done for APM. And some of you, have you been to any other ones? You'll think, oh, bloody hell, this is boring. It's the same sort of stuff. Well, I'm sorry, but NEC is very, very systematic. And a lot of the stuff you'll see tonight is very, very similar to some of the other NEC contracts. Clearly, there are some differences. Please ask questions, and Ellie will break in and ask them as we said. That's my intro slide. I have been with MacDonald since I was a small child. I've been playing with NEC for a number of years. I do contracts mainly in the water sector. I've got some massive contracts in Bangladesh I'm supposed to be working on at the moment, but I lead on NEC issues across MacDonald and spend a lot of my time giving training on that. I've actually been training for the last 2 days, so I'm hoping my voice holds out. As Ellie pointed out, I was on the NEC team that moved from NEC 3 to NEC 4, and I was also part of the little team that developed the NEC's X29 for climate change, which might get a mention later on. So that slide I've shown some of you before. It's a very busy slide, but it shows you that NEC has a contract to do just about anything. The contract we're talking about tonight is this one over here. I think I've got a button. Let me try that. Oh, there we go. Look at that. It works. The one we're talking about tonight is the NEC Term Service Contract. This is not for constructing something. It's for operation and possibly maintenance of something. It's providing a physical service. If it's just a professional service, just writing reports and advising, then the client will use instead the NEC's professional service contract, the PSC. So, starting with the big hitters, why would we ever use the term service contract? Fundamentally, we're providing a service over what the contract calls a service period. Anybody that knows my training will know that italics means it's in the contract data. The contract data of the document will tell you what the service is in a one-liner, and also the period for which that service is to be provided. So it could be including an operating and maintaining an asset. It's a service, it's not a project. A project has a clear end point because a thing has been constructed. We are not talking about constructing a thing, we're talking about providing a service with a thing. Wide range of issues. The one I like to tell people about, in New Zealand, there is a term service contract to provide a boat service across the Lake Manapuri, way down in the South Island of New Zealand. It's a physical service. You can include some renewals and some replacements. It may include some improvements. And as you'll see later, there is a concept of a task order, which allows the client-side service manager to effectively instruct mini projects which are done as a separate mini project over and above the routine service. So that's a one slide as to why you need to be listening. If you don't do any of that, you might as well go and have a beer and enjoy your evening. As a summary, again, high level, for those of you that possibly know the construction contract or the professional services contract, I've already said it's providing a physical service, whereas in ECC you provide the works. In the PSC, you provide a service, but it's non-physical work. In terms of time, under the construction contract and the professional services contract, there is a completion date to do stuff. In this contract, there is a service period to provide the service, possibly extendable. And there's also, for each individual task, there is a task completion date. PSC and ECC have a program. TSC has a plan for providing the overall service, but it does have a task order program for each and every separate task. We don't have a site. Instead, we have what's called the affected property. And like the PSC, we do not have any compensation events relating to physical conditions or to weather compensation events. We'll talk about those issues in a little bit more detail later on. Okay, so the structure of the presentation is like that. This is what I'm going to talk about for the before award. I'll be honest, I'm slightly concerned about this presentation because I've never given it before, and I've certainly never tried to get through the term service contract in only an hour. So we'll see how we go. I don't want to rush it too much, but we'll see how we go. So, but fundamentally, we'll talk about what we do before award, and then afterwards. So roughly, I'm going to target myself to get through that in roughly half an hour, and then give you a half an hour on the basics of the contract management. So, starting off with building the conditions of the contract. In true NEC fashion, the same as for the ECC and the PSC, the most of the clauses in the contract are in clauses 1 to 9, the core clauses. The client then gets to choose a payment option. Here they've chosen option C. We'll talk about them in more detail in a moment. You've then got to choose a dispute resolution option. You can then choose from a whole series of secondary options. You can then choose from a jurisdiction-specific options. Hopefully pretty obvious, we're talking UK, because it says UK in the title. And then if you need to make any specific changes to the standard conditions, that's done through what are known as the Z clauses, which are the additional conditions of contract. So that's my Lego slide. The contract is wonderfully modular. You have to know enough about it to decide which of those options are appropriate for this particular contract. And we'll talk about all of those as we go forward from now. The Lego contract. So the payment options are those three. Option A, lump sum. Option C, target. Option E, completely reimbursable. That language, the A, C, and E, again, is used consistently across the patch with the other big NEC contracts. So, a slide or two for each of those options. The price contract, the lump sum, this is a lump sum contract. The lump sum, which is a colloquial term in NEC, is called the prices. To do that, to get a lump sum from a bidder, of course, you've got to define your service very well in your tender documents. And the contractor gets paid the items in this document called the price list. Now, the price list just has 3 columns. It has, I lied. It might have 5 columns because you can have a mixture of either just lump sums or you might have quantities and rates. And if you as a client provide quantities, the bidder gives you a rate, and therefore the client takes the risk of how many of that quantity actually needs to get done. That's your choice as a client in the way that you set up the price list. There's a clause which requires the operations to relate to the plan, too much detail. The items are hopefully obviously priced by the bidder, and we pay the contractor on completion of those defined lump sums and quantities where stated. So those of you that know the NEC construction contract, the engineering construction contract, I hope you will recognise there's a bit of an overlap here between option A, lump sum, in the ECC, and option B, bill of quantities in the ECC. Hopefully that's enough high level for the priced contract. And most clients, in my experience, will want to use option A, priced contract. Alternatively, you can use a target contract. The price list looks exactly the same. The prices is now colloquially a target, not a lump sum. The target will go up and down with compensation events, which is an NEC term of which you'll hear more later. The contractor tenders a fee percentage, and the contractor does not get paid the items on the price list. Instead, the contractor is paid what the contract calls their defined cost plus a tendered fee percentage. Show that on a picture. So at the tender stage, the tenderer gives us a tendered total of the prices. Unfortunately, that line never ever goes horizontally on your contracts. I think you'll agree. You're probably going to go up and down. And in NEC language, that up and down is driven by compensation events. In an option A contract, the contractor would be paid these prices. And at the end of the job, the contractor would have been paid the number where my mouse is on the top right of your screen. However, in the target cost contract, instead, as I've already told you, the contractor is actually paid defined cost plus fee. On my picture, the contractor might do very well, green and coming under, or they might have a bad contract and go over, red. Colloquially, in our industry, we talk about pain and gain. The way the contract works is for the client in the tender document to set what are called the share ranges and the share percentages. What does that mean? Well, let me try and illustrate that. If the contractor comes in green here, they get paid green because that's the price for work done to date, defined cost plus fee. Oh, but well done, Mr. Contractor, you've saved some money. You've saved the money between purple and green, and this number here says, well done, contractor, you can have 35% of the saving within that band. The client then effectively takes the 65% saving and everybody's happy. The 0% here means that if the contractor if that green line were to be below the 80% level, I should have explained, the 80% is the percentage of the final target. The initial target is not relevant anymore. If the contractor comes way down, they can have 35% of the 20%, in other words, the 20% saving between 100 and 80, but the 0% says they can't have any more. Perhaps the client was concerned about the contractor just making too much money, and maybe they were concerned about the target being set too high. Hopefully that's clear. In contrast, if the contractor goes over, again, the contractor gets paid the red line, defined cost plus fee, but now they're going to have to pay back to the client the 50% overspend, 50% of any money between the red line and the purple line. And quite often we see clients set a number typically around about 120% of target. If the contractor goes way over, this 100% effectively means it's a guaranteed maximum price, because if the contractor goes above the 120, they have to pay back 100% of anything over the 120, hence the yellow on the slide. Again, I hope that's clear. It's easy for me. I've done it before. If you've got any questions, please ask them. In a cost reimbursable contract, actually one thing I should have said, sorry, the time period when we actually assess the contractor's share is not necessarily at the end of the service period, it's at the dates that we state in the contract data. So for example, it might be quite typical for a client to assess that share percentage every year. If, on the other hand, we have a reimbursable contract, that's option E, same language in all of the NEC big contracts, the prices is, okay, it's still there, but it's not really commercially, the contractor's not really tied to that number, it's just a forecast, it's just a budget. Again, the contractor gets paid whatever they spend, defined cost plus fee, and they tender a fee percentage to calculate the fee. Fee equals fee percentage times defined cost. So the contractor, hopefully you can see, has no financial risk except making sure that their fee percentage is enough to cover any costs which are not in defined cost, which is basically head office overheads and whatever profit they want to make out of the job. So typically we only use a cost reimbursable contract if the scope is completely undefined, if it's an emergency, or for whatever reason the client doesn't want to try to pass the pricing risk onto that line. That word should be changed in my slide. I'm very sorry, I will make a little note to myself. Option E, change the word consultant to contractor. My apologies. Option E, consultant. I'll make a little note for later for me. Okay, so to summarise that, in terms of overall what I call estimating an efficiency risk, the option E, clearly that risk is with the client, but then the client has a lot more flexibility, whereas in option A, the opposite is the case. What I call the efficiency risk is with the contractor because they've given us a fixed price. Makes sense. Option C, I've shown intentionally as a big ellipse because the actual risk allocation depends on the numbers that the client has used in that share profile. Share profile, colloquial term for the share ranges and share percentages. Okay, dispute resolution options, very quickly. In the UK, you will always use W2 because W2 is the option when what we call the Hugh Grant Act applies. Sorry, Housing Grants, Construction and Regeneration Act. If that's the case and your contract is essentially a construction contract, which may not be the case actually in your operations, you'll need legal advice on that. But both of those options provide to bring in an adjudicator to make a decision on your dispute. If you don't like the adjudicator's decision, you can take that onward and upward to what we call a tribunal, which is going to be stated in the contract data to be either arbitration or the courts. Okay, so now we have the secondary options. Now, if I'm doing a training course, if I had a bit more time with you guys, I would just say, have a look at that. Any questions? Doesn't really work today. X1 and X2 are risk allocation decisions for a client. Do you want to give the contractor any protection from inflation? If so, use X1. Do you want to give the contractor protection from changes in the law? If so, use X2. I strongly recommend you use both of those options. X12 is very rarely used. It's only relevant if you've got two contractors working side by side and you want to find ways to encourage them to work together. New options in NEC 4 is one which is effectively collateral warranties, one which is for information modelling, aka BIM, in the UK or across the world. So this requires the contractor to give you an information model. Possible. I've never seen that used yet in my experience with the TSC, but there's no reason why it couldn't be. Also, an odd one, you've got X11, which is used if the client wants the contractor, if he wants to be able to terminate without a stated reason, in other words, termination at will, the client now needs to include option X11. There's more secondary options. Low service damages, we'll talk about briefly later, where we want to give a particular service level. If the contractor doesn't meet that service level, they are hit with amount of money to pay back to the client for not providing the service that they tended to provide. Every contractor will want to see X18 in the contract because that gives a clear limitation on their liability, and I'd strongly recommend clients to use that option. X20, if you want to include any key performance indicators, you can. X20 gives you a reporting mechanism for KPIs. If you want to go further and put pounds, shillings and pence, sorry, that's an old term for younger people on the call. Sorry, if you want to put monetary value to meet, bonuses for meeting your KPIs, you can do. Along the bottom of the slide are the different options relating to UK specific options. Again, if you've got any questions on them, ask them, but we haven't got time to go into detail. New to NEC 4, again, there's a simple option which encourages the contractor to suggest ideas which might reduce the whole life cost of the thing to the client. Again, I would recommend you include that. There's no reason why not to. And now, all bells and whistles, try and wake you up. New option, X29, which Richard Patterson was one of a team of 4 which drafted this. This came out earlier this year. This allows a client to include any performance levels for anything and against those performance levels to have either a bonus and or a damage for not meeting. So at MacDonald today, literally, we had our big event called the Carbon Crunch event, and I hope X29 got a mention, because we are getting to a point, maybe, when we might even set targets for, would you believe it, targets for carbon. Maybe that's a bit too exciting. I have a presentation specifically on X29, and one slide says, NEC contracts ready to save the world. Maybe I'm getting a bit carried away there. Okay, the jurisdiction's secondary options we've just seen. Additional conditions, there shouldn't need to be too many, but typically clients will find some things that NEC doesn't cover, and therefore you're able to add in specific changes to the contract, whatever you feel the need to change. If you know your NEC, there's normally an obvious place to do that, but they do need to be drafted very, very carefully to fit with the language of the contract. Sadly, we often see them drafted by numpties, sorry, that's a technical term, who don't understand the TSC and make a right mess of it. So just make sure if you're a client, you get somebody helping you that actually knows what they're doing. That's quite a good idea in life in general, isn't it?
Hi Richard, one question.
Yeah.
So the question is, can the option X29 be included in X20?
Okay, that's a really, you don't know how good that question is. Thank you very much for that question. What I decided not to say, but I could have said, is X29 is effectively a bit of an overlap between X20, which is all about positive KPIs, positive bonuses to the contractor, and X18, which is all about negative damages. Effectively, X29 allows you to combine what you might have said with X17 and X20. I'm pretty sure that the guidance for X20 recommends that you use the guidance for X29 recommends that you use X29 exclusively and don't mix it up with 17 and 20. That was a really good question. Thank you very much. Any more, Ellie, or are we good to go?
Please continue.
We'll continue. I've got to get a move on. Flipping heck. Okay, so all I've just told you about is only the conditions. I need to get a move on. TSC is different. Pretty picture. We have in our contract, we have a contract data, which points to part one comes from the client, and it points to the conditions. A document called the scheduler cost components, too much detail tonight, and the all-important scope document, which is what you actually want, what the contractor is required to do. The contract data points to those documents. Part two comes back from the bidder, and it points to the price list. At the client's decision, if you want to, you can get the contractor to give you what's called scope provided by the contractor for its plan, which is a little bit more detail about what you're going to get from the contractor. And also, if you want to, you can get the contractor to give you a plan at the tender stage, which then becomes the accepted plan for the start of the contract. The conditions talk to all those documents. And the beauty of NEC is that when you come to a letter of acceptance or a form of agreement, you can literally just point to the contract data. The instructions to bidders, of course, will not be included in your final contract. Okay, those of you who know that a construction contract has a document called site information for factual information to help the contractor price the physical condition risk. In the term service contract, there is no compensation for physical condition and there is no site information document. If you've got any factual information about your affected property for existing condition survey, the only document to put that in is the scope. Okay, the scope. I love this one. What does it say on the tin? Does anybody remember Ron Seal? I remember the advert, but maybe it's because I'm too old. The contract says, classic NEC language, the contractor does what it says in the scope. Contract also says the price list is not scope, so you've got to get any obligations that you want to put on the contractor, any obligations and constraints must be set out clearly in the scope. And it's so important because as soon as you have to change the scope, it will be a compensation event, which you're now going to have to agree with the contractor, and the contractor will normally get more money. Also in the contract is a clause down there at 6311. If there's ambiguity in your scope and you have to change it to correct that ambiguity, the contract says effectively the contractor wins. So if you're writing the scope, it's absolutely critical. That's where the effort's required. There's no standard structure imposed. However, the guide notes, which are very, very good, they point you to a whole list of places where the contract, the conditions of contract, point to statements that need to be made in the scope. You've already read them. There's a few there. I'm not going to try to give you, I haven't got the time to read them and talk to them, but understand that you've got to say something about all these things to make the contract effectively whole. Also, the guidance notes have gone further and do give you a suggested structure to make sure your scope covers all these required issues. Damages I talked about. Typically, a client will want to have commercial incentives to provide the service. If so, you can use this X17. And I ought to say on my slide now, in the new world, when we come to X17, as I've already told you, you could instead, you could use X29, the climate change one. Again, maybe I should explain, although it's called climate change, it can have a performance levels, can be set for absolutely anything, not necessarily only climate change issues. X17 is very simple, it's only one sentence, and you can read it. If a part of the service doesn't meet the service defined in a service level table, which the client's going to have to write, the contractor pays the amount of low service damages stated in the service level table. This contract is used, for example, for facilities management. So you could have a service level about how clean the floor is, as long as you're able to measure how clean the floor is. And then maybe you can give the contractor a bit of a slap if the floor is not as clean as you wanted it to be. Maybe not a good example, but you can see hopefully what I mean. A warning for you using the TSC: it does not cover design of plant and materials. There is nothing in the contract about design of things that are to be included in the affected property. Yes, there's design of equipment. The equipment are things that the contractor brings along to provide the service, but don't get left behind. Also, as a warning to any contractors listening in the standard TSC, if there is some design that you get asked to do, for example, you might get asked to do some design as part of one of these tasks that I've teased you with. Under the standard contract, you will have a fit for purpose liability, which as a contractor, you will know that you will try to avoid something like a plague. In terms of the financial amount of liability, that can be limited by X18.
Hi, Richard. One more question.
Yep, please.
Someone's asked, for option E, the scope is not defined, so we say the service is outside of the scope?
Okay, really good question. The scope still has to be well enough defined so the bidder knows roughly what they're going into. They know what they're being asked to do, but the scope doesn't have to be defined to the ultimate detail because there's no pricing of it. The contractor gets paid their costs for fundamentally doing what they're told to do. I hope that's enough to answer your question. If not, come back. But that's the principle. That's the same in any NEC contract. Okay?
Thank you.
So the truth will out. If you've got a poor scope, you're going to find out about it. So make sure you put the effort into having a good scope. Risk allocation. Firstly, as I've already said, the first decision on risk allocation is which main option you're going to use as a client. Then you decide whether or not you're going to give the contractor all of the quantity risk by making them price lump sums rather than giving them quantities. Then, as I've already said, option X1 and X2 are specific risk allocation decisions. But then, in the NEC standard way of doing it, For individual risk events, the magic language in NEC is compensation events. The way that works is that under the contract, the contractor effectively has to price everything that isn't a compensation event. If it is a compensation event, the client has made it so because they want the contractor not to price that event, knowing that if that event happens, there will be some extra money. Therefore, the client will have some money in their contingency fund to pay for such events. There's a detail in the contract which means if an event arises from the contractor's fault, they don't get paid any extra money. So because of that, the compensation events, what that list of compensation events is critical to your risk allocation in your contract. Many of you will come across the idea of a risk register where all the procurement people have a good chat and work out where they want to put the risks. If in that risk register, the client decides to keep a risk and therefore keep the prices a bit lower, the effect of that, to make that happen in your contract, you've got to make clear that that risk event is stated as a compensation event. So where are they? In the standard document, there's 18 of them in one clause. There's a space now, and in my slides here, I haven't mentioned anything in purple is new to NEC 4. So I'll make that clear again when I update my slides. I'll put another little note to Richard, a few little changes to make here. So in the contract data now, there's just a very simple box. It says additional compensation events are. So if you want to change the risk allocation, if you want to correct to protect the contractor from another risk that isn't in the standard, you can do it very easily. There's also a couple of secondary options that have a compensation event. And also, if you want to tweak the risk profile, you can do that in your Option Z additional conditions. What are these compensation events? Well, you've got to go and read them, take some time. But for the most important one is the first one, because you will keep changing the scope. Each time you change the scope, ka-ching, compensation event. And there are several clauses, compensation events, where the client doesn't do what they've said they're going to do, either in the plan, which is the plan for the overall service, or in the task order program, which is specific to the task order.
Quick question, Richard.
Yeah, please.
Does the contract need to raise an early compensation event to get paid, or after the risk has happened?
Okay, really good question. It's coming probably a bit later. The contractor, if the service manager, which is the name we haven't mentioned yet, is the person on the client side, if the service manager does something which causes the compensation event, the service manager is required by the contract to notify that event. If the compensation event arises for some other reason, then the contractor is required to notify the compensation event. Good question. The only bit I want to make clear to you here, again, is that there's nothing in the standard contract for physical conditions or weather. So in terms of risk allocation, when we award the contract, the number that is called the total of the prices. Anything within the total of the prices is a contractor's risk. They've priced it. Anything outside the total of the prices, you've got to make sure is clearly a compensation event. Very, very simple, but very, very core to the way NEC works. And again, that's the same slide that I use on the PSC or the ECC. It's the same NEC language. I've said it's a contractor's risk, but because of the way option C or E work, because we're actually paying the contractor for what they actually spend, ultimately, even though it's called a contractor's risk, under the option C or E, it's really a shared risk. In the contract data, there's a box where either party can tell the other party to put something in a document, which the NEC calls the early warning register. Putting it in that early warning register, all it does is make sure that the issue gets talked about. It does not, does not change risk allocation. If we want to change the risk allocation for a particular event, we need to change whether it is or is not a compensation event. If you're interested in any of that stuff, have a look at a very good paper written by a young chap a few years ago, updated recently for NEC 4. Defined cost. I've got to move on. Defined cost. It's used for payment in options C and E and for all compensation event assessment. And it is built up using a document which the contract calls a schedule of cost components, or in the option A, a document called the short schedule of cost components. And also there's a mechanism or a function called disallowed cost, but only in options C and E. How does the NEC tell you what defined cost is? The answer is this document, the schedule of cost components, which breaks cost down into these 8 headings. Most of these headings, it's real money. We pay the contractor whatever they spend. Some of these headings, some of the items, we don't pay real money. Instead, we pay a tendered rate. That tendered rate is in the contract data. Contract data is a nice little document like that, which you have to fill in as a client. That comes to you as a Word document. You fill in the boxes. I've already shown you on the previous slide, there's 2 bits to it. One from the client, one comes back from the contractor, and fundamentally you fill it in. The numbers or the things that are of interest from the bidder, they have to give the client a tendered fee percentage, which if you were listening, and if you have time to take all this in, gets applied on top of defined cost. They also have to tell you where they wanted any areas outside of the affected property where they might want to work. They have to tell you key persons that you asked for, so key roles, and possibly scope provided by the contractor, and possibly the plan, as I mentioned earlier. They will definitely have to give you a price list, and they will have to give you a tendered total of the price list for options A and options C. Lastly,
Richard, we've got a question.
Yeah, please.
Sorry. Can you issue an early warning prior to call off a contract?
Okay. Firstly, under the term service contract, we don't use this term call off. If you want to go back and listen to one I did a couple of weeks ago, there was one on the framework contract. We have a call off for individual contracts under the framework. Here, today's presentation, we're just talking about a single contract, the term service contract. So strictly speaking, early warnings are notified after award by either service manager or contractor. But as I showed you a little bit earlier, there is a little box where at the tender stage, either party can say, pleasy wheezy, when we get started, can you put this particular issue on the early warning register? And therefore, it's effectively a pre-contract early warning. I hope that makes sense. Ellie, you can maybe tell me if it makes sense. Maybe you don't want to be brave and say so. Okay, thankfully, we've now got a contract, guys. We've got a contract, but I've already taken up nearly 40 minutes of your life. Let's rattle through now the key aspects of the contract management. I told you this was going to be quite hard in an hour. That's the core clauses, and we'll use that as a structure for the training. It's common sense. That's a picture of the people involved. And if the client doesn't have a service manager, if the client needs advisors, they might use the NEC Professional Services Contract or the short contract to appoint them. The contractor on the right-hand side might well need to use subcontracts, and they don't have to, but they might use one of the NEC offerings of a subcontract. That's a one-pager on the key jobs that the service manager and contractor are going to have to do. And in true NEC fashion, they're going to do it together, collaboratively. Because all these things, actually maybe not the first one, but most of these things require a toing and froing between service manager and contractor. On my training courses, I love to upset people by saying the service manager is close to God. Apologies if that upsets anybody. What I'm trying to say, it's not the client does all this stuff. The client sits in the background and just pays the money. It's the service manager that does all of the day-to-day contract management. There's no separate supervisor that you might know about under a construction contract. In this contract, it's the service manager also. The service manager is doing all the commercial stuff, but it's only the service manager that's also doing tests and inspections. My favourite slide. You've seen this before, some of you. This is my lovely slide for everybody doing NEC. First sentence says, do what it says in the chuffing contract. You can't do that unless you read the chuffing contract. And the second sentence, the Patterson interpretation, if you Google that sentence, you get a load of diatribe written by the lovely lawyers. I don't care. I don't care about, I should do, sorry, I'm an NEC specialist, of course I care. What I want to tell you is that sentence needs to mean to you, chuffing, talk and listen to each other. So read the contract, talk to each other, and then go into writing and do what it says in the contract. That is my one-page summary of every NEC contract, and it's the most important slide you will see tonight. Okay, more detail. Communications in writing, within a period for reply. What you don't know yet, everything in italics is in the contract data. So you go and have a look to find what we've set as a period for reply, typically a couple of weeks. And whenever the contract says notify, it has to be done separately. To make all that work, you need a system to how you're going to manage this stuff. You can get by with email and a spreadsheet, but please, 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 I'm not on commission. But go and have a look at the bespoke in the cloud IT systems available from various people, which make this contract management a lot easier. Some key clauses. Accepting anything from the contractor doesn't change their liability. Service manager can delegate. Service manager can change the scope or change a task. And one particular clause, which we'll spend more time on, the service manager can issue what are called task orders. Early warning, some people have already mentioned. Very simple, it's the same word in every big contract. Service manager and contractor are required to notify, of any event which could do any of those three things. There's also a clause where they don't have to, but they may give an early warning of any other event which could just increase the contractor's costs. They don't have to, but they may. All the service manager has to do is put that matter on the register and decide whether or not to instruct an early warning meeting or whether we can wait for the next routine early morning meeting in purple, because that's new to NEC 4, to deal with the event. We have this early warning meeting, we talk to each other, we decide what we're going to do, we update the register, and we move on. That register is effectively the agenda and the minutes for the meeting. And it's a rolling agenda, a rolling minutes as we go through the project. Update at the end of the meeting, the service manager revises that register and pushes it back to the contractor. Anybody that knows NEC will know that early warning is a very simple and a quite lovely process. In my training courses, I always recommend that you go home and try it on your husband or your wife. What does the register look like? Okay, I've said there a risk register. That's a mistake. That needs to be changed. It's changed in NEC. Language NEC 4 changes the risk register to an early warning register. My apologies, I've still got an NEC 3 slide there, unless maybe it's going to say change to NEC 4. No, it doesn't. The early warning register is required to have those two columns. It will normally have further columns as to where it came from, who notified it, when did we last talk about it, who's got to do certain actions and so on. And then the common sense columns, these are Richard Patterson columns. Are we going to talk about it this time? Yes or no? Data filter, running order, 106432, data sort. Suddenly your risk register, a spreadsheet, simple spreadsheet, becomes the agenda for your next early warning meeting. A very simple tool. Logically, if you're under the the term service contract, you may have a separate column to identify the number of a task to which an early warning might refer. That's a logical thing to do. Okay, the task. This is a big issue for term service contract, and this is very, very specific to the term service contract. It doesn't appear in the ECC or the PSC. I've told you you've got those two documents. In the facilities management and service contract world, we talk about these acronyms: planned preventative maintenance. So the routine maintenance that's needed to be done and the operation will be where we're given a monthly rate. A monthly rate in the price list. Operation. Okay. And for any reactive odds and sods maintenance here and there, there'll be an item rate, resource rates to work out how much to pay the contractor for doing that little bit of reactive maintenance. If after award you want to change something, change the service, do the same thing somewhere else, change the constraints, then you will issue a change in scope. That will be a compensation event, and that might entitle the contract to a change in the prices. If, on the other hand, there's something extra that you want to be done within a certain time, then you have to have a process for getting something done within a certain time. It makes it effectively a mini project, and in NEC TSC language, that becomes a task. And that task, as we'll see, has a task order program. The pricing for that task is based on the items in the price list. Anything that's not in the price list, we'll assess it in the same way as we assess a compensation event. Little article on same issue. The language of tasks, and this is a horribly boring slide, it's just copying straight from the contract. And I'm not going to read it out to you because you can read it quicker than I can do it. You just read and I'll just press the buttons. That's my longest pregnant pause on this sort of presentation. I hope it worked. What I want you to get used to is that if you're going to run a term service contract or any other NEC contract, you've got to read the words. Hopefully that wasn't too hard. So, pretty picture now. I want to issue a task. The service manager instructs a quotation for a task, telling the contractor what they want, saying the starting date and the required task completion date, and the amount of delay damages. So we can actually add delay damages to a task. The contractor's got 3 weeks to give us a quotation. That quotation is based on a task price list. And again, as I mentioned before, we use the rates in the price list where applicable. Not applicable, we assess those items as per assessment of a compensation event. The PM's got 2 weeks to reply. The green, because we've talked to each other and we're happy with the quotation, they just accept the task order. Task order is issued. Task price list gets included in the overall capital PL price list, and the work is now added to the scope. So we've added this chunk of work. Or we can ask for revision, or we can tell the contractor, you are taking the mick. That quotation is ridiculous. I'm going to tell you how much you can get paid for doing that task. You can see why I put that in red, because that's likely to cause some animosity with your contractor. If that happens, though, the service manager notifies their assessment, and again, everything's included in the contract. If the contractor doesn't like that assessment, they have to go through dispute resolution. Task and time. As I think I probably said, you just read, haven't you? You read the clauses. The obligation is to do what it says in the task by the task completion date. The plan is required to include the key dates for each task, but the program for each task is a separate document. And this is where it's quite radical, and you need to understand the words about managing the program in this term service contract are exactly the same. This is a task order program, sorry. The words are exactly the same as they are in managing the construction contract. So your little task on the TSC, the words about managing the program are the same in the contract for Balfour Beatty to build the whole of High Speed 2. Some people might argue that's a little bit over the top, but that's what it is, and that's what I'm telling you. Okay, task and time, the compensation event process, again, is exactly the same as it is in the construction contract. Sorry, I haven't got time today to take you through the nuts and bolts of that, but fundamentally we have to assess the effect of the compensation event on the planned task completion in the program, and if that planned task completion is delayed by your compensation event, we give the contractors some more time by moving to the right, the delay to the required task completion date. And NEC 4 has changed the language to make it clear that before we do that assessment of the program, we first update the program to the dividing date. That's an awful lot to take in if this is new to you. If you understand ECC, you'll say, yeah, Richard, fine. Contractor's main responsibilities: do what it says in the scope, give us a plan for how we're going to go about providing this long-term service. If the contractor doesn't give us a first plan, there's a mechanism in red, because it's nasty, is to hold back some money off of the contractor. The plan is important because if the contractor doesn't do what it says, it's a defect. And if the client or others don't do what it says in that plan, the contractor has a compensation event. So it is a critical document for your overall service. And I would recommend to a client that you get the first plan in place before award. You make sure the bidder gives you a decent plan so you know who you're dealing with and you've got some comfort they know what they're doing. That plan includes a whole load of detail, and that detail, again, is very much like the language that some of you will know in the construction contract. There's mechanisms when the plan is submitted to you as the service manager for acceptance. There are stated reasons for not accepting, and you've got to use one of those reasons, otherwise it will be a compensation event. And when the plan is revised, as you'd expect, it shows actual progress. How are we getting on? It's a live document, and how the contractors are going to sort out any defects. Also, fourth bullet point, any other changes the contractor fancies making. The plan is very much the contractor's little story about how they're going to provide your service. 3 places where we have to revise the plan. Although the last one is not really a formal change to the plan, it's a markup to the plan, which is required to show the effect of any compensation event on the existing plan. That's going to be a nice Word document in track changes, I would suggest. Big bang in red, slap bang wallop. Sorry, if the service manager hasn't accepted the plan for a reason stated in the contract, the service manager is required to step in and assess any compensation event. So hopefully you can see that's a clause, that's a slap clause in the contract. It's a remedy to encourage the contractor to do what it says about the plan. I've got to push on. Here we are, where we are, 9:20:25. Keep going, Richard, keep going. Time. The contractor, provides the services. Yes, obviously the client provides the property, and the contractor, the service manager, has a right, if they want to stop the contractor doing any work, which will trigger a compensation event. And again, I emphasize again, the process for program is the same as in the construction contract. Very detailed. That was quick, wasn't it? Brilliant. Payment. Be glad to know we're not going to do 7, 8, 9. We're just going to do 5 and 6. Payment, pretty picture. That's the language of the contract. We've got these top line here. The price is effectively what's been tendered. whereas the price for services provided to date is the big chunk of what the contractor is going to get paid. And hopefully, as you will have picked up already, those terms are the same term, but the definition of that term depends on the main option. Okay, I've cut out a whole load of detailed slides. I should say, by the way, when I share these slides, if you've got the time and enthusiasm, there's an awful lot of more detailed slides in the after the event. So they're still there in the presentation in this deck of slides if you want more detail. Compensation events now, key aspect of any NEC contract. You know where there are, I've already told you. That's what they look like, or those are examples of some of them. I've already told you. In the real world, you'll go and read the contract. But what I'm going to show you now is the basic process, which again is the same for any NEC contract. The difference here is that when it comes to assessment, if the compensation event only affects the quantity of work done, then we price it based on the tendered prices, just like we did in the old days. We have a priced contract, so we use those prices. The problem is that in most cases, the contractor will say, oh, well, it doesn't only affect the quantity. You're asking me to do that at a different time of day. It's not quite the same. And therefore, we switch to 63.2 and go back to NEC standard. The change the prices is assessed as the actual defined cost that's been done and the forecast defined cost that needs to be done. And again, the massive word in NEC, as I was shouting at my trainees today, forecast! In the NEC, sorry, we didn't get the warning of the shouting, did we, today? Forecast is a key word in NEC. When there's a change, we don't just keep records and add it up to see how much it's cost us. We're required to sit in a room and agree a forecast. If it's too difficult to use that defined cost, there's a clause which allows you to do a deal based on rates or lump sums. Be a little bit careful doing that, Mr. Service Manager. Obviously, issues over governance as to how you arrived at those rates or lump sums. There's a clause which says if the contractor was naughty and didn't give you an early warning, you can assess the event as if they had given you the early warning, in which case you might have been able to do something more differently and possibly more cheaply, and therefore the contractor loses out if they haven't given the early warning. The quotations have to include for risk, and once the deal is done, they're not revised if the forecast on which they were based turn out to be wrong. Again, standard NEC clauses. Okay, one caveat to that, the service, okay, I'll follow the story. I've already told you that we don't reassess a compensation event if the forecasts turn out to be not correct. I've already also, I think, maybe I haven't actually, maybe I did tell you, the forecast can include for risk. And if the service manager wants to take risk out of that quotation and therefore bring down the quotation price, the service manager, not the project manager, that's another mistake on my slide, there's far too many of those today. The service manager may state what are called service manager assumptions to take risks out of the assessment. I mean, I put that in there. I made that mistake for you to realise that I've obviously stolen this from a different contract, and the slides are the same because the process is the same because it's wonderfully NEC. If the assumption that we've told the contractor to make turns out to be incorrect, then we go back in again and there's another compensation event to price the change, the correction to the assumption. Hopefully simple. Maybe I'm asking too much in the timescale today. But what it does do is give you, as the service manager, the opportunity to take risk out of the quotation. One slide for the flexibility of the service manager. Firstly, before you give an instruction, you can, if you want to, ask the contractor to give you a quotation for that proposed instruction. Obviously, you're going to do that if it's a big thing and if you've got the time to do so. You can use assumptions, as I've just mentioned. That's another part of the flexibility. And when it comes to you can ask for quotations for alternative ways of dealing with the problem that's caused by this compensation event. You might ask for quotations with different technical solutions. You might ask for quotations with and without service manager assumptions. And lastly, you might ask for quotations with and without a delay to the task completion date. You might want to do that if that task completion date is really critical to your business and you're happy to pay a bit more money for an option, an alternative way of dealing with it without having a delay to the event. And lastly, as I've already mentioned, you can use rates or lump sums instead of defined cost. So that's just a nice one-page summary of all the flexibility you've got to deal with any single compensation event. And now pretty much the last slide, you'll be glad to know. Just check the time, how are we doing? Not too bad. One slide to show you the process for compensation events, e.g. a change to scope. Service manager instructs that change to scope with a 14.3. They're then required to notify that compensation event and instruct a quotation. When they do that instruction, they're going to check to see all of those clauses. We've mentioned all of those in our previous discussions. I'm not going to go through them again because I haven't got time. The contractor's got 3 weeks to give you a quotation. The contract quote. So on my slide, I should emphasize the purple here is not new to NEC 4. The purple is just effectively the clause number under which one side or the other has got to give a notification under the contract. Putting together that quotation is a difficult thing, and the contractor will have to take into account all of those clauses as part of the assessment of the compensation event. Here, the service manager has then got 2 weeks to reply. It's actually through the same clause there, 62.3. They can accept, which is lovely because it means we're talking to each other and we've already seen a draft, or they can ask it to be revised, or nuclear option, they can say, I'm really not happy with your quotation. I'm going to make my own assessment, and you can like it or lump it. And the lump it is take me to the dispute resolution process. If the service manager does that, so within 2 weeks, they've got to say, I don't like it, I'm going to make my own assessment. And as soon as they say, I'm going to make their own assessment, they set the clock ticking for the 3 week period within which they have to make that assessment, after which they notify the answer. And again, the compensation event is stated to be implemented under the contract. So that's the straightforward process for any compensation event, notification, quotation, response, for any compensation event that was triggered by an action of the service manager. On the other side of my picture is an example of a compensation event notified by the contractor. The contract requires that notification to come within 8 weeks. It comes under clause 61.3. Sorry, my light's gone off. I hope you can still hear me and or see me. The compensation event, well, 61.3. The contractor will tell you which event it was. Then the process says the service manager's got a week to say yes or no. If they say no, the contractor goes away. If they say yes, we ask for a quotation and we carry on down the left-hand side. Lastly, there's a mechanism in the contract. If we don't respond within a week, the contractor can give you a little nudge and say, if you don't respond within a further 2 weeks, I'll assume it is a compensation event and you want me to give you a quotation. So this is where the contractor is kicking the service manager to try and get the process working. Likewise, and more seriously, if the service manager hasn't responded to that £1 million compensation event quotation, if the service manager hasn't responded and the contractor gives them a nudge, so to be clear, the service manager's got 2 weeks to respond. If they haven't responded at all within that 2 weeks, the service manager can give them a nudge. That starts another 2 week period. And if that further 2 week period, there's still no response, then the quotation is treated as effectively deemed accepted. And the same clause, the same words apply also to where the service manager is making their own assessment. Now, I hope for you guys out there that one slide is quite a useful slide for the whole compensation event process. It's quite difficult to get it onto one picture. Okay, the font's getting a bit small, but I hope it makes sense to you all out there. So, as a summary, my friends, the truth will out. If your scope is not good, in particular, likewise the contract data, you will have a nightmare running your TSC contract. And also, as I hope I've made clear, the NEC demands active commercial contract management. This is not a contract to put in the bottom drawer. For further information, ... and a thank you. I'm now going to spend 3 seconds turning the lights back on, and Ellie's going to tell me whether you've got any further questions.
Hi, Richard. Well, there was a couple of extra questions, but what I'll do is I'll pop those over to you via email after this event, and we'll get your answers, and then we'll pop them up with the news story and the recording of this event afterwards.
Okay, that's fine, because I have gone just a fraction over the hour. Not too bad, actually. I'm quite amazed I did that in the time available. I do apologise to everybody on the call, because there was a shed load of information, I think you'll agree, in that presentation. I mean, to be honest, we could happily do that in 2 separate hours, one for contract preparation, one for contract management. Maybe that's the next time we do it. Okay, well, thank you very much for your attention and those questions, and I hope that wasn't a complete waste of an hour of your life. Thank you very much.
It was
indeed.
great. Thank you very much, Richard. Thanks, everyone, for joining us this evening. And obviously, thank you again, Richard, for giving up your time to host this event and all the other webinars that he's run in this series. Like I mentioned, all of the webinars can be found on the APM YouTube channel. We would be grateful if you could complete a post-event survey and also check out our upcoming events and webinars on the APM website. But for now, all I've left to say is keep well, everyone, and enjoy your evenings. Thanks, Richard. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.